My name is Janice Holmes. I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of History at the Open University, and but I'm also based here in the Open University's Belfast office, where I look after the activities relating to the Faculty of Arts. This conference is the latest in a series of partnership activities that we've done with PRONI, but it's also the latest in a series of research activities which I've been aware of that have taken place in recent years, which have sought to uncover the story of temperance in the north of Ireland. Until recently, I think our understanding of temperance movements in Ireland has been very much shaped by our understanding of Catholic-based organizations like Father Matthew's campaign and the Pioneer Movement, probably most famously. And it's really only one scholar, Elizabeth Malcolm, who has written back in 1986 more broadly about temperance in Ireland more generally. So I think in all of that, Ulster was rather neglected. So it was really that 3 years ago, or 3 or 4 years ago now, I think a partnership between the University of Ulster and the Irish Temperance League led to some work that Gillian McIntosh did on the ITL's records, and led then to an article on coffee houses in Belfast, which was published in Urban History. And then a few years after that, we were lucky in the Open University to once again work with the ITL and to obtain a grant from the AHRC, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, for what was called a Collaborative Doctoral Award, which paid for a PhD student to investigate the ITL's archive, which is based here at PRONI. And that is the lovely Orla here, and supervised by me and Paul Dara. And so it's been great that this conference is now taking place at this point, and reflecting, hopefully, and bringing together, I think, a growing understanding of Northern temperance activity. But when we put this conference together, we were very conscious that, that the Irish temperance movement, and indeed temperance movements in general, are really international in focus. And so we wanted to make sure that the Irish Temperance League was placed into a broader context. And how the temperance movement in Belfast and in Ulster was connected to that in Dublin, Cork, Scotland, England, and farther afield. And I know that that sounds like a big ask for one small afternoon, but I have complete faith in our speakers that they're going to give us that big picture. And I want to just move on to introduce them very shortly. But before I do that, I just want to say very, very briefly, thanks. First of all, thanks to PRONI for giving us the venue and for hosting the conference. Secondly, to the ITL for sponsoring the PhD studentship and for supporting Orla throughout her studies. And as a gesture of thanks, we would like to invite you all afterwards for some refreshments, temperance, I hasten to add. But please, we would very much appreciate you if you took advantage of our hospitality afterwards. And as Stephen has said, at the break there should be then the small exhibition. So I'd like to turn now to the substantive matters of the day and introduce our first speaker to you. We're very pleased to welcome Annemarie McAllister, who's a senior research fellow in the Department of History at the University of Central Lancashire. She started out as a historian of Italy, but has obviously seen the light and converted to the subject of temperance in 19th century Britain, and where she has written extensively, in particular, on the Band of Hope, the children's temperance movement, and where she's particularly interested in visual representations in temperance literature. And in 2013, she curated an online exhibition titled Demon Drink, Temperance in the Working Class, in cooperation with the People's Museum, which you can still view online, and which is a lovely, I think, example of the way in which digital technologies can work very well with history. I'm going to invite her to come up now, and then I'll be introducing the next speakers in turn as they come along. Okay, thanks very much. I hope you enjoy your day.
Thank you very much, Janice. Thank you. Thank you, first of all, to PRONI and to the OU, and to the members of the Irish Temperance League indirectly for this invitation. It's the first time I've been to Belfast. It's a beautiful city, I'm really enjoying it, and I got quite a bit of work done in the archives yesterday at PRONI as well. So it's a win for me. I just hope that you get something out of this as well. I've called my talk The Alternative World of the Proud Non-Drinker, because I'm not suggesting that people who were in the temperance movement were separatist, far from it. But what I'm fascinated by as a cultural historian, someone who looks at people's ideas, beliefs, what made them get out of bed in the morning, what made them tick, is the alternative world that was a positive creation of the temperance movement. When I was young, and indeed before I started working on the temperance movement myself, I really absorbed a picture of temperance as a negative movement. And it's very easy to give that. Temperance involves not doing something. What I want to show in this talk is how temperance was positively doing something. However, I do need to start with a few negatives. And this is where I see if I can use this. No, that's not it. Yes. So if temperance was the solution, what's the problem? Obviously, human beings have had a checkered history with alcohol. Domestic violence, illness, misery, death, many social problems have been seen as coming from alcohol. I want to show how the teetotal solution was developed and was taken up by millions of people until, for example, by 1900, 1 in 10 of the UK population was estimated to have signed the pledge, and over half the children were in the Band of Hope or similar children's organisations. Drink has always been seen as somewhat of an individual choice or a problem, but it was only really in the 18th century that it became seen as a social problem. You may know this image of Gin Lane by Hogarth in 1751. But I wonder, do you know its companion piece, sorry about the different colour, Beer Street? And what Hogarth, who was a social campaigner along with his friend Henry Fielding, the novelist, wanted to do was to show that gin was destructive and beer was a national healthy drink. In a sort of echo of the current debate about the EU, I thought I'd have to bring that in today. The people in Beer Street on the right are shown as healthy, eating roast beef, naturally full of vitality. In the left-hand side, there is a coffin being carried. There is a drink shop doing business. The children are seen outside the drink shop using... Is this a... No, it isn't, right, okay. The children can be seen outside the drink shop drinking little glasses of gin known as squibs, which were a halfpenny. You've probably heard drunk for a penny, dead drunk for twopence. Well, the children's glasses were a penny. A halfpenny. And in Beer Street, there is no sign of children drinking. The adults who are drinking healthy beer, because at this period, of course, having a bit of extra weight was seen as healthy. By 1730, London had over 7,000 gin shops for a population of around 700,000 people, and an annual consumption nationally estimated over a pint and a half of gin a week. How had this come about? Well, political and economic. In 1688, we had William of Orange coming over to England with his wife Mary, and he brought the tradition of gin distilling. This was seen as solving a problem, what you did with surplus grain. So the gin industry really dates from the end of the 17th century. However, by the middle of the 18th century, concerns had arisen over this, and this is what Hogarth is summing up here. But you can see what the answer that Hogarth suggested was to move on to beer. And this is what government policy started to do. In 1830, the Beer House Act was passed. This said that any householder, for a very small payment, could brew their own beer and sell it from their house. However, the dangers were apparent. This is an illustration from the 1830s showing the route from the pawn shop, where people are obviously getting the money. In some cases they were paid in the pub, of course, through the beer, through the pub, and you can see that the two directions they're going to is the workhouse or the jail. This was especially common, especially prevalent in industrial centres such as London, Manchester, Liverpool, Belfast, of course. Intoxication promised oblivion for the thousands, if not millions, of people who had flocked to these industrial centres and often lived several families to a room. Pubs offered warmth, companionship. Even a small beer house was better than the places that people lived. So in Liverpool alone, more than 50 beer shops opened each day for several weeks after the passing of that 1830 Beer Act. And if you look at some drink maps, which were compiled by social researchers in the later 19th century, you can see that in some streets, in particularly poverty-stricken industrial areas, there was a place selling beer at every other house, property. So there were many temperance societies by the 1820s. The American Temperance Society, set up over here in Belfast in 1826, and provided a model for John Edgar's Ulster Temperance Society, which dates from 1829, and there was also a Temperance Society from 1829 as well. Originally, of course, temperance meant moderation. However, in Skibbereen, and this is, I think, Skibbereen's one place in history, perhaps, although I may be doing it a disservice, a society to promote total abstinence did start in 1817, but it didn't really have much influence outside Cork. The date of the total abstinence movement in the UK is usually thought to be 1832. By 1840, temperance had largely become total abstinence, and it was largely due to this man, Joseph Livesey, who incidentally started the university I work at, which is why we have got the archive of the British National Temperance League, which we got in the 1980s. Livesey and 6 other working men in Preston, another industrial city, signed a pledge that they would drink no alcohol, even for medicinal reasons. And he had a group of followers, often known as disciples. One of them, John Finch, visited Ireland regularly. For example, he gave a lecture in Strabane in 1835. So even before Father Matthew's crusade, which is towards the end of the 1830s, in 1838 it starts, you've got a working class movement to save individuals and to save others. And this is why I want to show you this pledge. This is from the Blue Ribbon Army, often known as the Gospel Temperance Movement. Again, American, came over to the UK in the 1880s. But it shows the duty of those in the temperance movement, not simply to save themselves from the misery, from the poverty, from the eventual illness and death which would come from alcohol, but to save others. And it's that duty to others that underpins quite a lot of temperance activities. There were many other temperance groups. I don't want to spend the whole talk naming them, but some of the notable ones were, for example, the Sons of Temperance. This was an American group founded in 1842 in New York, but coming over to the UK in 1846. You've got one of my favourites, the Independent Order of Rechabites, named after the sons of Rechab in the Bible, who would drink no wine. This was founded in 1835. Like the Sons of Temperance, it was a friendly society where working people would club together to provide money for illness, for eventual burial fees, and to support each other, and to enable them to save. In the exhibition that I curated, we had a very early mortgage given by the Independent Order of Rechabites, by which people were enabled, ordinary working people, were enabled to pay a couple of pennies a week and to buy a house for £3. You've also got the Band of Hope, which I work on currently. This was founded in 1847, the children's movement. The first meeting in the slums of Leeds, there were 300 children. A few months later, 4,000. And by the end of the 19th century, there were over 3 million child members. And this lasted up to the mid-1920s. In 1886 and 1923, they had their annual conference in Belfast, and the Band of Hope was run under the aegis of the Irish Temperance League. This is a mid-20th century pledge, just to show you that it went on, and it still exists today as Hope UK, which campaigns against alcohol and drugs, and I've spoken at their conferences and worked with them closely. So, what did people do to join the temperance movement? They signed the pledge. I'm using a couple of lantern slides here, and the rise of the temperance movement intersected with the technological advances which made magic lantern shows very convenient, very cheap, and possible to give in almost any place. There were travelling lantern shows where, for example, the lantern slides were projected on the side of the wagon. There were lantern shows that were open air, on sheets that were hung onto the side of houses, and of course, rather like the PowerPoint we're using, in comfortable places inside. The image on the left shows the advantages from the pledge, which again are to the individual, but can be passed through society. But this actually shows directly what the pledge means. Prudence, piety, patriotism, perseverance, prosperity, and progress. And this is one of these wonderful Victorian fondnesses for word games and playing with words, which anyone who studies the 19th century finds so much of. The individual benefits are linked to the wider agenda of progress, of patriotism. We see this very much throughout the two world wars, in fact. And the temperance movement did have a wider political agenda throughout the United Kingdom, and at this point the whole of Ireland, of course. Obviously, it wanted to convert individuals. The phrase that's often used is moral suasion. But also, for example, the United Kingdom Alliance was founded in 1853 in Manchester to bring about national prohibition, and we very nearly got it in the 1880s and again in the 1890s, but Liberal politicians pulled back from it at the last minute. Also, local control of licensing, whether any licensed premises should be allowed. This, in fact, did come into law in the early 20th century in Scotland. And one or two areas did actually vote down the sales of alcohol. But this was fairly speedily overturned, so the local option didn't work as well as they hoped. And smaller single-issue campaigns, such as the protection of children, banning children under 13, for example, from buying alcohol in pub, making sure that if children under 14 bought alcohol, it was in sealed and corked containers, etc. Education, temperance as part of hygiene came onto the syllabus of United Kingdom schools. And indeed, yesterday I was finding out material about the Northern Ireland Board of Education and how it was promoting the temperance syllabus in the early 20th century in schools. It was never made compulsory, but it was suggested that teachers use this syllabus and teach about the evils of alcohol as part of hygiene and health. And, of course, drink driving. There was a long campaign to bring in, for example, the breathalyzer several years before it eventually was adopted. From the 1920s, there's quite a lot of material about not driving when one has drunk alcohol. So, as I've mentioned, I want to look at how temperance said yes to things, created an alternative world. Anyone who's ever been on a diet will know it's harder when people around you are eating biscuits. And this is part of the reason why the alternative world was created. It was to support members of these groups. It was to reduce temptation for members. like the Rechabites, for example, who didn't want to meet as the other working people's friendly societies had met in the upstairs room of a pub. They wanted somewhere that was not selling alcohol. They met in one of the early coffee houses. To retain members, obviously, if you feel part of the group, you feel involved, and to gain new ones. Something else I'm going to talk about when I look at buildings is to inscribe the power of the temperance movement in the public arena. Events such as processions, parades, and even the mute testimony of buildings like temperance halls, temperance coffee houses, temperance halls, temperance billiard houses, the list goes on. They showed people that the temperance movement was there. It was there to stay, and they were going to enjoy themselves. And also, of course, to show by example that alcohol was not necessary. And here's an illustration. I do work on children at the moment more than adults, of little recruiting sergeants. This is from 1903, and it's boys persuading other boys that they should come along to the Band of Hope. But all the temperance activities I'm talking about were really acting as recruiting sergeants. So, I intend to look at the temperance world by what they drank, where they met, what they did, how they enjoyed themselves, and how they spread the word, which was, of course, their duty, if you remember that blue ribbon pledge earlier on with St. George killing the dragon to save other people. So, first of all, what did they drink? Well, obviously, they drank tea. Remember that when the temperance movement, or the teetotal movement, as I should probably call it, started, public supplies of water were not really very safe. Therefore, the boiling of water involved in making hot drinks was an extremely important measure. In the archive that I work in at my own university, there is a collection of temperance china, and there's even a cup and saucer with a little label on saying, Joseph Livesey drank tea out of this at my house. And tea became something of a fetish among many of the early teetotalers. However, tea doesn't suit everyone. There was also, of course, coffee. Here's an advertisement for coffee essence, which reminds me of camp, if anyone's old enough to remember camp coffee, which was really quite horrible, but still. And this was promoted as an alternative to beer as well. Of course, neither of these are really nourishing, and many of the advertisements for beer played on the nourishment from the hops, etc. There was a whole campaign saying beer is best in the 1930s, to which many temperance organisations replied with postcards, posters, and even vans travelling around with slogans saying beer is best for cancer. Beer is implicated in lots of cancers of the throat, bowels, stomach, etc. Guinness is good for you. Again, temperance organisations replied by using that slogan, saying Guinness is good for you if you want to crash your car, if you want to have upset in your home, if you want to throw all your money away across a pub counter. So they weren't very inventive in this, but the main alternative to beer that was put up until the early 20th century was, I don't know if anyone can guess it, what do you think? Any suggestions? Nope.
Lemonade?
Nope. Milk. The idea was that working people, after a hard day, would refresh themselves and nourish themselves with a glass of milk. This was sadly doomed to failure. There were indeed, when I was young, milk bars, but I don't think milk ever really took off. This is actually a pageant on the theme of milk from 1937. And you can see that they're dressed up. The children on the right there are showing the results of not drinking milk, and the characters from folk tales, etc., are well nourished and showing that they have drunk milk and they're doing well. There were also quite a few others, as you suggested. There was lemonade, there was Ovaltine. I'll run through a couple of them. There was cocoa. The Quaker families, who often had gone into cocoa production because they felt it was socially useful, were often temperance. There was beef tea. This is an example of Brand's beef essence, but Bovril was first produced in 1874. It wasn't originally a temperance drink, but a couple of years after the production, it was seen that it could be sold as a temperance drink. And there were many soft drinks, such as lemonade, herbal mixtures, such as ginger beer, sarsaparilla, peppermint water, and in 1908, Vimto was developed as a temperance drink. It was originally called Vim Tonic, to give you energy. Where did they drink these? Well, they drank them at home, but people from the temperance movement also wanted to go out and enjoy a drink. So there were coffee taverns, there were also coffee houses, there were coffee public houses, there were coffee palaces, believe it or not. Apparently there was a coffee palace in Leicester which could seat thousands of people. There were also temperance hotels, and people travelled and stayed. They did not want to stay necessarily in a pub. You get directories coming up by the 1880s, such as Hawes's Handbook to Temperance Hotels, which features several temperance hotels in most towns. There isn't a town that doesn't have a temperance hotel. And in cities, there are frequently 1 or 2 pages of temperance hotels. You had temperance halls. This one is in Kirby Stephen and is still used as a village hall. And these buildings provided a place for people to hold events, to mix, without the temptations of alcohol. Ironically, some are now converted to pubs because they are large buildings, and who is going to want to run a large building? Wetherspoons. The next building I'm going to show you is a Wetherspoons pub now, which, oh, sorry, wrong way round. It's that second one, I am sorry. It was a temperance billiard hall. When billiards became fashionable in the 1880s, local temperance groups subscribed, and there were 2 companies which kept afloat and were in business simply putting up temperance billiard halls in villages, towns and cities. This is how big the movement was. The image on the right, which I gave you a bit early, is actually a temperance music hall in Bishopsgate, London. I've only found reference to 3 temperance music halls, but my goodness, I didn't realise there were temperance music halls. And that leads me to what people did in temperance billiard halls, which is singing. I've just published an article in a journal called Popular Music, which is called Temperance Battles. And thousands of these temperance songs were spread by publication in magazines or being taught in groups, and they were for working people. So they didn't just rely on conventional music notation. They relied on what's called tonic sol fa, which may be more familiar to you from The Sound of Music as do re mi. And you'll see when I put this next image up that if you can see underneath, there's actually S, T, L, yeah? Sol, La, T, yeah? Yeah? And this was a way in which children and adults who hadn't got a conventional musical education, once they were given the first note, could actually decode this previously hidden skill of learning music. You can see why I called the book of the exhibition Temperance and the Working Class, can't you? It's somewhat of one of my things. Anyway, the songs weren't all serious, as you can see from the title of this one. It's short, so I'm going to give it you. Young ladies, now listen to me, and keep just as quiet as mice. When I sing you a song, it is not very long, which contains a good piece of advice. It is this: no matter what people may say, no matter what somebody thinks, if you want to be happy the rest of your days, don't marry a man if he drinks. Don't marry a man if he drinks. Come join in if you want. I'm going to give you another chorus. Come on. No matter what people may say, no matter what somebody thinks, If you want to be happy the rest of your days, don't marry a man if he drinks. Don't marry a man if he drinks. Now, this just shows you, I've done this at several events. I mean, some events I sing a lot of the time. People have fun. People enjoy singing together. It's something that we lost in a way. And this was one of the many ways in which temperance people didn't just sit in a corner saying, oh, I'm not drinking, what shall I do? They went and enjoyed themselves. There were concerts for all ages. Here's a very early programme. Concerts raised funds as well as being part of the rational recreation movement. Again, using your time and learning things, experiencing things, doing things that were worthwhile. Choirs might practice songs locally, then travel to a central venue to give a large concert. This shows a concert as part of a huge meeting in Exeter Hall in the mid-19th century. But at the Crystal Palace annual fete, for example, where there was even more room, the young singers of the Band of Hope provided choirs of 900 singers in 1862, 5,000 in 1868, two 5,000 choirs in 1873, and by 1884, 15,000 young choral singers were performing to an audience of many thousands more. How did people get there? Well, this chap, Thomas Cook, his excursions started, he was a temperance worker. He started in 1841 as an amateur, taking 500 members for a 24-mile return trip from Leicester to Loughborough, and eventually started a business doing it and invented the travel agent. These bandsmen from Southampton are on their annual summer trip, and many members of the temperance movement took advantage again of developing technology of the railways to go out from industrial centres where many groups lived to the countryside. The UK weather meant that many meetings were of course inside, but where possible, festivals were held outside in pleasant surroundings. And this rural festival, you can see these are largely from the middle of the 19th century, had things like rustic sports. I gained a great deal of information yesterday when I was looking at the Band of Hope in the 1920s in Northern Ireland, looking at how they organised their pageants and fetes and what sports they had, such as tug of war, which was not considered suitable for girls, by the way. Here you've got more inside meetings. These children have put together a display showing their grasp of drink-related economics, looking at the nation's drink bill. This is from 1903. Here are women on the streets of Manchester in 1915 actively buttonholing people. They were said to be a public nuisance, good for them, to try and get them to sign the pledge. The poster says, follow the King's lead, because of course in the First World War, the royal family, this is King George V, wasn't it, had abstained from all alcohol and said that alcohol would not be served in the royal residences as a gesture of solidarity. You may know, Lloyd George said that we are fighting two enemies, drink and the Germans, and drink is the worse. I could give you a whole talk about temperance in the First World War, but I won't. Even the less obviously propagandist events, such as this procession with children, inscribed temperance, wrote it on the attention of the public. On such occasions, of course, members would show their commitment by wearing insignia. Badges, chains of office, collars, this was Rechabites, and of course these bandsmen are all wearing temperance uniform. There was even a group called the United Sons of the Phoenix who had cloaks made to look like phoenix feathers, showing that they were reborn in the temperance movement. They would carry banners, such as this huge one, that's the only way I was able to get a picture of it, we used that for the exhibition, and bannerets, which were rather more portable. Less publicly, but just as influentially, the temperance world sustained its commitment by hundreds of magazines and newspapers. The circulation of these reached 250,000 in many months. which was a huge number for the 19th and early 20th century. And I've written quite a bit about temperance periodicals. Just very briefly at the end of my talk, I want to look at temperance periodicals because this is where we get a lot of information from. Unfortunately, registers, lists, tickets, programs are known as ephemera, they've gone. But the magazines, the newspapers have often been bound, and this is where we can find some of our sources. And I'm always trying to encourage people to look at these periodicals more. Brian Harrison, the great historian of temperance, or Victorian temperance at least, had an article in 1982. He said that temperance periodicals had, or periodicals of any group, had a threefold function: to inspire, to inform, and to integrate. And they really did a huge amount of work. Again, I could talk for ages about this. From the early days, in the 1830s and 40s, this is a periodical, if it comes up, yes, published by Joseph Livesey and those early men of the temperance movement. Through to the early 20th century, this is from South Wales, published in Cardiff, the Abstainer. Through to the 20th century, this is around the period of the Second World War. We can see that these periodicals fed into public events and how the temperance movement saw itself. Look at this, for example. Here's an illustration from the Band of Hope Review, a children's magazine. It's boys on the temperance lifeboat going to save adults. Look at this image from a pageant. It's boys on the temperance lifeboat rowing off. They may be on the back of a cart pulled by a horse, but they're using that same image, rather like St. George killing the dragon, of temperance people, adults or children, saving others. I'm lucky enough to have become friends with Brian Harrison, this historian I mentioned, and he said to me that he now believes that he wishes he hadn't stopped at 1870. He thinks the temperance movement did actually reach its zenith after 1870, and that's certainly what I believe. It was hugely important for many working class people, and it did shape lives well into the 20th century. It's interesting that now many young people are choosing to go to dry bars. Many young people are saying that they won't drink. And I wonder, are we going to see a resurgence of temperance? I'm planning a conference in 2 years' time called Radical Temperance, yesterday, today and tomorrow, which will have contemporary charities working to support people with alcohol problems, as well as historians. The reason I've referred to this long 19th century in the title of my talk is that, as the dates of many of my examples show, as well as the membership figures, the temperance alternative was a valid choice. And I feel, to be honest, it continues to be so. When we think of the temperance movement, we often think of images like this. But here's this chap drinking Vimto in the mid-20th century, and people are still drinking Vimto. So that's what I want to leave you with. Thank you very much.
Well, welcome everybody, and thank you very much for this opportunity.
Hello.
So I'll get started. So, contrary to popular belief, there has been an active temperance movement in Ireland since 1828, and one which still continues to this day. It has been a fluid movement throughout the years and has had many changes in its terminology, methods and its followers. One of the most successful organisations to emerge from this movement was the Irish Temperance League, formed in Belfast in 1858. By the late 1850s, the Irish temperance movement had evolved through three stages: moderation, total abstinence and prohibition. This paper will argue that the formation of the Irish Temperance League moved the temperance movement in Ireland into its fourth stage, which focused on uniting different methods in an attempt to unite more reformers in a common cause. But in order to contextualise the work of the League, this paper will begin by discussing the stages of the temperance movement prior to the formation of the ITL. In the 10 years between 1820 and 1830, spirit consumption in Ireland had increased by 6 million gallons. The middle and upper classes in Ulster began to voice their concerns, particularly in terms of the sale and consumption of spirits on a Sunday. Due to similar concerns, the American Temperance Society was formed in 1826. By 1829, reports of its good work had been impressed upon the Reverend John Edgar by his friend, the Reverend Penny, who had emigrated to America 10 years previously. Following this, Edgar signified his conversion to a temperance lifestyle by pouring his remaining stash of whisky out his parlour window at his home in Alfred Street. Following this, on the 24th of September 1829, the Ulster Temperance Society was formed at the Old Tract Shop in Waring Street in Belfast. Alexander S. Main, proprietor of the Ulster Tract Depository, and the Reverend James Morgan, minister of Fisherwick Presbyterian Church, were founding members of the Ulster Temperance Society, and later in the century were founding members of the Irish Temperance League. At this stage, it was only spirits that concerned temperance reformers. All other forms of alcohol were permitted, so long as it was in moderation and that drunkenness was avoided. The first stage of the temperance movement in Ireland began among the urban Protestant middle class in Ulster. By the early 1830s, there was 150 temperance societies in Ulster, containing an estimated 15,000 members. In pursuit of its aims, the Ulster Temperance Society made use of the press and the pulpit. It held meetings and demonstrations in order to change public practice when it came to drinking spirits. The Ulster Temperance Society also hired an agent who travelled around Ireland forming local temperance organisations. By adopting these methods, the Ulster Temperance Society set the precedent in Ireland for a temperance movement that was organised, professional and educational. These traits remained important, especially within the Protestant temperance movement. In addition, they were traits upon which the ITL would build their organisation in the 1850s. Yet the findings of an 1834 inquiry into the state of drunkenness suggest that drinking habits of the upper and middle classes were changing. However, this was failing to filter down to the rest of society as Edgar had hoped. For the majority of society, and among those whose drinking habits were perceived to be problematic, moderation was seen as ineffective. Increasingly throughout the 1830s, moderation became insufficient for many temperance reformers who wanted to bring about moral and social reform. Subsequently, by the late 1830s, temperance was no longer synonymous with moderation. It now comprised moderationists and teetotalers. Teetotalers believing that total abstinence from all intoxicating drinks was the only effectual moral remedy. They generally considered moderation to be misguided, as it permitted the use of certain alcohols and placed temptation in the way of drunkards. One contemporary article which discussed the changes at this stage stated, "It was found after a trial that the old temperance societies were not equal to the task that they had undertaken. Moderate drinking furnished the recruits for filling the ranks of the drunkards' army. These good men did not as yet understand the urgency of the disease they had undertaken to cure. The cause they had espoused was actually crushed by the recoil of their own engines. All honour to these philanthropic men who set the machinery in motion." In Ulster, the Belfast Total Abstinence Association was formed in 1836. Between 1836 and 1838, the association attempted to bring the working classes into the movement. By 1838, Mr. John Hawkins, a reformed drunkard who was popularly known as the Birmingham Blacksmith, was touring Ireland promoting abstinence. Alexander S. Main had been responsible for inviting Hawkins to Ireland. Main's proactive approach in this matter demonstrates an attempt to make total abstinence more accessible and relatable to the working class and rural poor. For instance, as a reformed drunkard, Hawkins provided a visual example of the transformative benefits of a teetotal lifestyle. The leadership of the total abstinence movement in Ireland was mainly Protestant at this stage. However, in Cork in 1837, total abstainers were trying to find an articulate spokesman who could draw the Catholic masses into the movement. Following this, Father Matthew was inaugurated as president of the Cork Total Abstinence Society on the 10th of April 1838. Therefore, while there was growing public interest in total abstinence movement in Ulster, it was Father Theobald Matthew's crusade which began in Cork, and which turned the total abstinence into a popular working class movement. Matthew was a Capuchin monk who travelled throughout Ireland promoting total abstinence and forming local societies. The crusade was not only aimed at the moral improvement, but also the social and economic improvement of its followers. Like Hawkins, Matthew attempted to empower the poorer classes by concentrating on the advantages a teetotal lifestyle could offer them. Moral suasion continued to be used at this stage, but instead of articulate arguments and tracts and sermons, teetotalism relied on images, medals, music, entertainment, and a range of alternative recreations to reach its largely illiterate audience. Yet due to the Catholic and nationalist associations to Matthew's movement, Elizabeth Malcolm argues that many supportive Protestants were uncomfortable taking the pledge from him personally or enrolling themselves in societies led by Catholic clergy. Conversely, however, a letter from the Belfast Total Abstinence Society Association to Father Matthew in 1838 challenges this argument and shows that there was a cross-community element to the crusade. The letter stated, "We bless God that this is a cause free from sect and party, that it is a great national question, calculated to be beneficial to all, in its sublime bearings and injurious to none. We rejoice that, without compromise either to our political or religious principles, for we would never yield to such a compromise, we are enabled to come here to meet you on your first near approach to our towns, and with our whole hearts to welcome you as the most distinguished and successful advocate of temperance, and as a genuine Irishman, to present you with a true Céad Míle Fáilte. You have long had our unmingled probation and entire confidence, and we now come to assure you personally that while you continue to act in the same noble and patriotic manner as you have hitherto done, you may rely on our heartily approved and unwavering support. Your exertions are much needed in Belfast." Evidently there was a desire to bring the crusade to Ulster, which resulted in a large open-air meeting at Banbridge in 1841. The connotations within this letter demonstrate an ability to place commitment to total abstinence above class, denominational or political affiliations. This rhetoric was incorporated by and later came to define the ITL. However, a great deal of power during Matthew's crusade focused on a superstitious notion of Father Matthew himself. Therefore, when he left Ireland to promote total abstinence in America, the movement went into decline. Yet sources indicate that the movement in Ulster continued to grow. The Armagh Total Abstinence Society was formed in 1849, followed by the Market Hill Society and the Armagh Juvenile Society in 1850. By 1851, the Belfast Total Abstinence Association stated that they had 16,000 followers. Therefore, while it was no means as popular as it had been during Matthew's crusade, there was still a significant teetotal movement in Ulster in the 1840s and 50s. Simultaneously, however, there was a growing number of total abstainers who were becoming dissatisfied with attempts at moral suasion. The Reverend James Morgan, for instance, demonstrated these feelings. He stated, "Temperance and abstinence societies have done much good, but the great national sin of drunkenness continues in spite of all efforts. Appetite is stronger than reason, and a depraved taste will withstand the most cognate arguments. Something more needs to be done than has yet been attempted, and when legal restraint is proposed, it seems to me defensible on many grounds." In this, Morgan was articulating a growing belief amongst drink reformers that the only way to control alcohol consumption was via restricting access to it or prohibiting its sale in various ways. In Belfast, this culminated in the renewal of the Overseer of Public Houses on the 8th of April 1853. Overseers supervised public houses on a Saturday night and a Sunday to make sure that publicans were sticking to the regulations which were set. Anyone found in contempt of legislation was liable to have his licence refused when it came time for renewal. However, the movement did not have power to issue official rejections or closures. Rather, they offered a suggestion to those who did have the power, such as the local magistrate. The Overseer movement signified the roots of the Prohibition movement in Ulster. This position, which emerged out of the Church of Ireland's civic role, was appropriated by individuals who were dissatisfied by contemporary licensing legislation. It suggested that the 2 years that it was in operation, it was responsible for closing 200 drinking establishments in Belfast. Yet despite results and enthusiastic support, the Overseer movement seems to have been a short, localised event. It was the formation of the United Kingdom Alliance in Manchester in 1853 that marked the start of the official Prohibition movement. The UKA's primary aim was the total and immediate suppression of the liquor traffic. From 1853, the Alliance aimed to get legislation which prohibited the sale and consumption of alcohol in Britain. This desire was undoubtedly influenced by the Maine Law, which had been passed in America in 1851, prohibiting the sale of alcohol. At the time, temperance was synonymous with moral suasion, and the target was decisively the drinker. Prohibition was aimed at destroying the drink trade, and therefore initially regarded as outside the bounds of the official temperance movement. Mr. J.H. Raper, parliamentary agent for the UKA, formed the Belfast Auxiliary in 1854. The inaugural meeting of the Belfast Auxiliary of the UKA was held in Victoria Hall on Monday the 9th of January. However, plans had been in place from around November 1853. It was this meeting which marked the start of the Prohibition movement in Ireland. The list of those in attendance included the Reverend William Johnson, Presbyterian Minister of Townsend Street Church, Mr. James Houghton, the philanthropist and temperance reformer from Dublin, and the Reverend Morgan of Fisherwick Presbyterian Church. All these individuals later became instrumental in the formation and success of the ITL. In fact, the majority of meetings held in order to discuss the main law read like an attendance list of eventual ITL members. Therefore, when the ITL was founded in 1858, it was a personification of the early prohibitionist movement in Ireland. Yet it was not just total abstainers who were present at these meetings. Moderationists such as the Mayor of Belfast, Mr. F.H. Lewis, and Reverend Edgar were present and discussed the necessity of such legislation. However, moderationists differed from total abstainers on the extent of legislation. They believed that partial legislation in the form of Sunday closing would be sufficient. However, prohibitionists remained resolute that full prohibition was necessary. Therefore, the meeting was often consumed by conflict from these two sides. As a result, the prohibition movement in Belfast at the time was stalled by a lack of unity between reformers. In addition, the uncompromising position of prohibitionists began to attract opposition from the drink trade. On the 6th of March 1854, Mr. George Pepper, a solicitor from Portadown, who was then secretary of the Belfast Auxiliary, published a death threat that he received from a local publican. The letter stated, You seem to exult in your hopeless task of persecution against the majority of the community. This note is to inform you and give you timely notice that if you continue, you will, as sure as God is in heaven, meet your fate sooner or later. Only for you, you wretched imp, there will be none of this agitation going on, but you will rue it when you get your head in your hand. Don't think that this is mere puffing, but it will happen if you do not desist. However, following Pepper's immigration in 1854, the movement lacked any direction in Ulster. One individual wrote to the Belfast Newsletter complaining about the complete lack of information on the workings of the prohibition movement. Moreover, the overall shortcomings of the main law, which had been widely covered in the press, hurt the British prohibition movement. By 1857, the UKA and its auxiliary societies were forced to acknowledge its considerable lack of progress. Therefore, by the late 1850s, the temperance movement in Ulster, in Ireland, was stagnant. Therefore, there was a desire for an organisation which would reinvigorate the remnants of the movement. It was within this context that the ITL was formed in 1858. The League's founding members included Alexander Main and the Reverend Morgan. As stated before, these individuals had been instrumental in starting the movement in 1829, but they were now setting up a total abstinence organisation which aimed for prohibition. Individuals such as Main and Morgan personified the evolution of the Irish temperance movement. It was their drive which advanced each stage of the movement when it became clear that it was not having any effect on drinking customs. The minutes of the ITL's first annual meeting state that they were modelled on the Scottish Temperance League. The Scottish Temperance League was a national organisation which focused on the promotion of total abstinence through the use of moral suasion. The League used the precedents set by the Scottish Temperance League to show how to structure and organise a national temperance organisation. However, the ITL also incorporated the legislative objectives of the UKA, as from 1858 the ITL merged with the Belfast Auxiliary. Typically, most temperance organisations in this period concentrated on a single strategy. For instance, organisations such as the Scottish Temperance League and the Belfast Total Abstinence Association focused solely on the method of moral suasion. Others, such as the UKA, followed an exclusively legislative method. Moreover, these two methodologies were often in competition with each other. In Scotland, the Moral Suasion STL and the legislative Scottish Permissive Bill Association competed with each other for money and support. The ITL, however, differed as it combined these two methodologies into a single organisation. In its mission statement, the ITL stated that it would fight for the suppression of drunkenness by moral suasion, legislative prohibition, and all other lawful means. This is unique and places the ITL in the fourth stage of temperance activity, which focused on unity. Moreover, this was progressive in the late 1850s. It was not until the 1890s that the Scottish Temperance League developed a legislative committee. In justification of its dual approach, the League rhetoric stipulated that by combining as it did individual duty in the shape of personal abstinence and social duty in the shape of prohibition, it was destined to succeed. I'm now going to turn to examine the dual approach that the ITL adopted in the 19th century. For its moral suasion operations, the ITL again employed a dual methodology, incorporating a high and low level strategy. The high level was the League's professional strategy. It dealt with the League's financial position, its social status as a philanthropic organisation, and its business ventures. The ITL believed that the key to implementing change was the union of all temperance societies in Ireland and a concentration of their moral strength. Between 1858 and 1914, the ITL developed a number of partnerships with other total abstinence organisations. These included the Band of Hope, the Irish National Temperance Executive, the Irish Women's Temperance Union, the International Order of Good Templars, the Independent Order of Rechabites, the Londonderry Temperance Council, and the Belfast Temperance Voters Council. Yet, as well as connections within the temperance movement, the League also developed strong links across a wide range of areas throughout Ireland. The League was widely successful in developing a network of teetotalers within philanthropic, political, educational and religious spheres. Of the numerous contacts mentioned in the ITL sources, only a select few will be mentioned here. Members such as the Reverend William Johnson and the Reverend D. McIntosh represented links with Presbyterian Church. Mr. John Piper, who was the principal of the Belfast Mercantile Academy, represented a link with the education system. Furthermore, Miss Angie Carlisle and Miss Isabella Todd represented ITL's links with the Band of Hope, the female section of the Irish temperance movement, and the women's suffrage movement in Ireland. Other members such as Mr. Marriott Dalloway and Mr. J.P. Corey were MPs during their time in the ITL, thus personifying the League's links to politics in Ireland. The network produced by the ITL gave the organisation a social prestige. However, it needed to generate income in order to survive. Fundraising was the inaugural tool used by the League. All of the ITL's operations dedicated time to the accumulation of funds. Individual members and affiliated societies were required to provide annual donations. Societies being required to pay the annual fee of £1, while individual members were required to pay an annual subscription of 2 shillings and 6 dimes. However, the amount coming in fluctuated and was an unreliable source of income. A guarantee fund, which was inaugurated in the 1870s, had attempted to raise £5,000 over a 5-year period. However, the amount pledged did not equal what was collected. For instance, in 1872, the League was promised £648, 12 shillings and 6 dimes. However, they only ever received £74 and 15 shillings. At termination of the guarantee fund in March 1877, the League stated that its finances were deprived of powerful support. In an attempt to combat the fluctuating financial status, the League often promoted the rhetoric of struggle and hardship in order to maintain the inflow of donations. In reality, however, from the 1870s, the ITL had moved into the cafe business and placed the organisation on a strong financial footing. The League first expressed a desire to introduce coffee houses to Belfast in 1862. However, it wasn't until 1874 that the League had the funds available to open its first coffee kiosk in Donegal Quay in Belfast. By the 20th century, the ITL had 24 establishments throughout Belfast, comprised of kiosks and luxurious cafes which provided refreshment for the upper and middle classes to avail of when they were in the city. This just shows the coffee, kiosks and refreshment rooms around Belfast. They also had the Lombard Cafe, that's it in 1910. This opened on the 30th of January 1878 and, as you can see, was specifically aimed for the more affluent members of society. The League became incorporated in 1900 and developed the Irish Temperance Trading League Limited. From this point on, the ITL was the philanthropic section of the movement, while the ITTL represented the business section. The ITL owned shares in the business section, meaning that they received a percentage of their income from its profits. In effect, the League formed a for-profit company that would fund their non-profit organisation. This is commonly known as the hybrid ideal, a model for charity organisations which strikes a balance between a social mission and a commercial enterprise. This approach to charitable work is still regarded as pioneering today, thus illustrating that the tactics used by the League in the 19th century was significantly ahead of their time. As I have shown, the first stage of the League's moral suasion work included a professional business approach. This fundamentally aimed to provide the organisation with the finances and networks needed to conduct its outreach work, which was based on philanthropic principles to persuade people not to drink. The outreach branch of the League's work focused on education and the provision of support systems which would encourage and maintain commitment to a teetotal lifestyle. Agents were employed by the ITL to give lectures on the dangers of drinking alcohol and to educate the public on the need for prohibition of the drink trade. This was always accompanied by collecting funds and administering the pledge to willing participants. Magic lantern slides were a commonly used method by ITL agents in the 19th and early 20th centuries. One of the most popular of the League's magic lantern shows in the 19th century was Cruikshank's bottle plates. The bottle, as they were commonly known, was a series of 8 cartoons which portrayed one family's descent into poverty due to the influence of alcohol. Interestingly, the family used in these illustrations were a middle-class family who began life in domestic bliss, but who ended up victims of crime, poverty and disease. Clearly the League suggesting to its audience that while sobriety was a ladder to affluence, alcohol was a slide into poverty. In addition, the League published the Irish Temperance League Journal from 1863 to 1903. The journal promoted the League's arguments on the moral, health, wealth and national benefits of total abstinence and prohibition. Although not an academic journal, the articulate and educated manner in which the articles were written suggests that the League was catering largely for a well-read audience. However, the League also made provisions so that the publication would remain available to the less affluent members of society. In 1866, it reduced the price of the journal to £1 in order to keep in line with cheap literature. That the League inspired to reach the working class readers is seen in the range of self-help advertisements and incentives that it published. For example, in the pre-war period, the journal included ads encouraging the working classes to buy their own homes. In addition to the educational and written material, the ITL provided followers with the provisions necessary to avoid temptation and uphold a teetotal lifestyle. The coffee house and kiosk located around Belfast was central to this, as it provided a social alternative to the convenience of the public house. In addition, respectable entertainment evenings in the form of lectures were also organised by the League. Large open-air meetings, which often had a guest speaker, were also a significant event of this nature. These were typically part of the League's summer programme. In 1876, the League reported that the attendance at these gatherings was very large and great interest manifested towards every phase of the temperance movement. Yet in addition to events with a significant educational ethos, the ITL also provided more leisurely activities. The League's social itinerary included a range of public soirees, exhibitions, bazaars and fairs which provided respectable entertainment for all the family. A regular feature was the annual Summer Gala and the Band of Hope demonstration which the League held in Botanic Gardens. Reports indicate that bands played all day, melodies were performed by the choir and there were games provided for the young. The League also ran entertainment evenings at the Ulster Hall and the Working Men's Institute. Rhetorically, this would remove any need to frequent a public house on a Saturday evening. However, it was the opening of the League's buildings at Lombard Street in 1878 which provided the organisation with its own space to host such events. Located in the centre of Belfast, the aesthetically pleasing building was no doubt a symbolic attempt to represent the power of the League and its growing place within Belfast society. The outreach work also included preventative methods, this largely centred on the League's work with children. The ITL merged with the Irish Band of Hope Union in 1860, becoming the Irish Temperance League, Permissive Bill Association and the Band of Hope Union. It aimed to have two agents constantly at work, one to conduct the general work of the League and the other to concentrate on the Band of Hope. However, the amalgamation with an Irish-wide union and the desire to be a national union was too ambitious considering the League's other areas of work. In the late 19th century, the ITL recognised that it would be more effective in becoming a Belfast-only union. In 1892, the League formed the Belfast and Ballymacarra Band of Hope Union, which contained an estimated 10,000 members between 6 and 12 years old. Many of these local societies regularly took part in fairs and parades organised by the ITL. Yet by the Edwardian period, the ITL had replaced its focus on the Band of Hope with a well-organised juvenile programme which primarily worked in day schools. During this time, the ITL hired school agents who gave lessons on the scientific and health aspects of the temperance movement. Elizabeth Malcolm argues that the legislative fight for Sunday closing and prohibition preoccupied the Irish temperance movement in the 19th century. However, as has been shown, this argument fails to acknowledge the significant moral suasion movement that was conducted by the League in the same period. Many of the formative members of the League had been active in the previous stages of the movement. The experience of these individuals influenced the League and has resulted in a fusion of the professional and educational ethos during Edgar's time with the more recreational atmosphere which was common during Father Matthew's crusade. However, the extent of the League's moral suasion work does not take away from its legislative branch, which was conducted alongside it. From the beginning of the organisation, the ITL acknowledged that there were many who would always remain indifferent or actively opposed to its cause, arguing that people who drink hardest are not the least bit convinced by our arguments. The League believed that the best way to combat these people was to destroy the drink trade and force them into total abstinence. In defence of this, the League stated, "The truth is that men forced to be sober do very often acquire a strong liking for sobriety. Its fruits are so pleasant and profitable that when they give it their hearty preferences, and thus it becomes their virtue in the truest sense." The League's legislative fight concentrated on three pieces of legislation between 1858 and 1914. The ITL began its legislative campaign with the fight for Sunday closing. The majority of the League's arguments for Sunday closing were based on the need to keep the Sabbath day holy. Due to the importance of Sabbatarianism, the fight for Sunday closing found more support than any other piece of temperance legislation. In August 1878, the Irish Sunday Closing Act was passed. The Act prohibited the Sunday liquor trade in Ireland, however it was limited to 1882 and the cities of Dublin, Cork, Belfast, Limerick and Waterford were exempt. In the League's opinion, the Act was incomplete, and it stated, "While thankful for any concession to the demands of supporters of Sunday closing in Ireland, we cannot accept the passing of a partial Sunday closing bill. For the remainder of the century and into the pre-war period, the ITL continued to fight for the Sunday Closing Act to be made permanent and extended to the 5 exempt cities." During this time, the League also fought for the Permissive Bill, which was introduced into Parliament in 1864 by UKA member Sir Wilfrid Lawson. The bill gave power to a borough or town or parish to decide by a majority of 2/3 of the ratepayers whether the sale of intoxicating drinks would be permitted. Between 1864 and 1879, votes for the bill fluctuated, however it was always defeated. The failure of the Permissive Bill pushed prohibitionists to fight for separate measures in their respective areas. In the north of Ireland, Conservative MP Mr William Johnson brought the local veto Ulster Bill before Parliament in 1886 and 1887. Over the 2-year period, numerous resolutions and petitions of support from a range of groups in Ulster were presented. Despite these measures to demonstrate a strong level of support in Ulster, the bill was thrown out each year before the second reading. The Irish temperance movement tried once again in 1888 and brought the local veto Ireland Bill before Parliament. However, like the Ulster Bill, it was dropped every time before the second reading. While full prohibition remained the League's aim, it followed the United Kingdom alliance in fighting for partial legislation. Rhetorically, the continuous enactment of selective legislation, such as was previously mentioned, would accumulate in prohibition. In pursuit of its legislative objectives, the League functioned as a pressure group from the early 1860s. Attempts were made at advancing political mobilisation throughout Ireland. Fundamental to this was public agitation, which the League conducted through public meetings and demonstrations. It printed posters and pamphlets on the necessity of temperance legislation and published numerous articles in the journal. Door-to-door canvasses were also conducted in order to bring the principles of current legislation directly to the people. Following its attempts at political mobilisation, the ITL turned its perceived public support into a political weapon, which it then used to maintain resistance towards contemporary practice and agitate for reform of local government. For instance, the ITL maintained opposition to new licences at quarter stations and assize courts throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. In 1863, the League demonstrated the efficiency which it could mobilise inhabitants of a working class area as a political weapon. Following the application of the Gin Palace at the corner of John Street and North Street in Belfast, the League sent a petition of opposition to local magistrates, signed by 777 inhabitants of the local neighbourhood. Yet, as temperance legislation was dependent upon the level of support it received in Parliament, any attempts at moral reform had to begin with the individuals who were at Parliament. From its formation, the UKA had set its sights on Westminster and became active in politics from 1857. In Ireland, the ITL, clearly influenced by the United Kingdom alliance, stated that it hoped that Friends of Temperance would seriously aid the return to Parliament of members holding view in favour of the prohibition of the liquor traffic. Circulars and test questions were issued to every MP in Ireland in an attempt to gauge their support for or against temperance legislation. The ITL put its support and social and financial prestige behind a supportive candidate. However, when one was indifferent or opposed to temperance legislation, the League attempted to destroy the candidate's vote. For instance, in 1885, the League was opposed to Conservative MP Mr William McCartney. McCartney was not opposed to all temperance legislation, but had made it quite clear that he did not support the League's fight for prohibition. Following his admission, the League threw all its resources in a campaign against him. A letter to the Belfast Newsletter in 1885 described the extent of the League's work. It stated, "The remotest villages of South Antrim are today placarded literally with thousands of bills in the name of the Temperance League, in opposition to Mr McCartney. I counted 35 flaming bills of 3 different descriptions on one wall in a county district, some of them 3 feet long. So far as placarding is concerned, the Irish Temperance League seem to be expending more money than the 2 South Antrim candidates twice over." However, the extent of the League's opposition to McCartney was considered unjustified. Many of the League's own supporters became uncomfortable with the rigid lines laid down and perceived this as a policy of coercion and intimidation. Yet the League ignored these warnings in regards to its actions and seemed unconcerned that its own supporters began to voice the same issues that its opposition had in regards to its relentless zeal. Again, in 1892, complaints were made about the volume of letters and resolutions that the League sent to Mr. Harland, Conservative MP for Belfast, from local bands of hope and Sunday schools. However, the rate of action and level of debate and the correspondence which the League's methods generated suggests that it had a significant level of political power by the 1880s. However, other than the Sunday Closing Act which had been passed in 1878 and made permanent in 1906, no other temperance legislation was passed in Ireland, and the fight continued up until the outbreak of the First World War. The ITL brought the temperance movement into its fourth stage, which focused on unity. Therefore, unlike contemporary temperance organisations, the ITL conducted these two methodologies side by side. More than this, however, the moral suasion side was simultaneously the foundation of the ITL's political ambitions, as it provided the League with the support, finance and connections needed to gain political strength and credibility. The League's vision was threefold. By the use of moral suasion, the League wanted to promote personal change in an attempt to diminish demand for alcohol. By legislative prohibition, it wanted to destroy the drink trade in an attempt to diminish supply. Together, this would build a society that was sober, respectable and disciplined. Moreover, the League's founding members meticulously incorporated what they perceived as the strengths of the Irish, Scottish and English temperance movements into their new organisation. As the Reverend William McGill, moderator of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church and member of the ITL, stated at the annual meeting in 1875, "The very perfection of this organisation is the blend of the high intellect of Scotland, the practical bearing in regard to moral matters of the Englishman, and the enthusiasm of the Irish heart in one grand and progressive action for the carrying out of their great spiritual and moral object."
So I'm sort of manifesting sort of a trinity. So I am Leanne, who I'm channeling her from New York, and Maura Cronin, who I'm channeling for about 4 seats down, but who's been up since 4 o'clock this morning. And right, so a familiar part of the urban landscape for us all really is water fountains. But they're so familiar to us now that they kind of disappear into the ether. So as you don't even notice you're passing them anymore, or in idle time you might say, what is that? Passing some great monumental piece of stone before finding out about it. So my favourite one is, I do an odd time things for the BBC, and the number of BBC people who have no idea that there is a fountain outside the Ormo headquarters, and that it's the Thompson fountain, or who Thompson was. I think they all should have a small handout on day one of going in there. And I think really we wanted to talk about these fountains because they are, such an ever-present part of our landscape, which we don't pay attention to as much anymore. And they speak to, I think, what both of the previous speakers spoke to so beautifully earlier on, the diversity of temperance profiles and the individuals who support temperance and who are so prominent. And I'm struck by what Annemarie was saying about, and what Orla was saying about making yourself visible in the landscape. These are the visible manifestation of temperance activism in the landscape. In a sort of not unostentatious way, but in a way that is underlies a temperance drive to be of practical use to others without drawing huge attention to yourself. Now that I'll undermine that slightly later on by naming the fountains who are named after the people who put them up. So we looked at Limerick, Cork and Belfast, and the drive in these cities in the 19th century, as in a lot of similar sized cities and of similar makeup, is to provide water to locals. And that's because unless you had access to money, you're relying on others to provide you with this water. So this is the first public drinking fountain in Limerick in about 1859. And when I speak Limerick, I'm more. This is erected in 1859. We don't really know where it was, but it is dated that way because of the Justice of the Peace, whose name is on it, Michael Ryan. In a couple of years, he was the agent for the Limerick Water Company, which was a private water company supplying water to the city. So this is kind of typical of those fountains, which have the subscribers or the donator's name attached to them, and then the city or the town supplies the water. So you pony up the equipment and they supply the material. In Belfast, the water commissioners are in charge of bringing water into the town. The builders pay a business rate for that, and then those who can afford to pay a rate. Poor people then have access to a communal fountain. So this is to provide a context for the later fountains, which are driven more by a need to provide public water in public thoroughfares, not for domestic use, but for people travelling to and from to their workplaces. As the ITL then later on did the coffee kiosks, they are on main routes of people travelling to and from for their work business, and it is preventative. So people need a drink of water, they're thirsty. Where would they go to get a drink? Otherwise, they might go into the pub, and they're in the pub. The next thing you know, they're having alcohol where they actually just went in for some other sort of refreshment. So then you see this wall-mounted fountain in Limerick as well, which was donated by the Malcolmsons. This is the John Square fountain in Limerick, and this was erected by the Perry and Jubilee Loan Society in 1865. I quite like historians of Ireland who do this was all Protestant, this was all Catholic, this was all the Presbyterians, this was all somebody else. In fact, in a lot of cases, things are collaborative between people who are active in their communities trying to push campaigns or efforts forward, and who find it much easier to get together to fund a fountain than they do to come to some sort of agreement on a matter of theology. It's not all or nothing. You can agree with people on some things and differ on others, and yet combine to try and do this public good. So I like this fountain particularly because it has one of the things about temperance. Campaigners in this part of the century who combine an activism in temperance often with animal welfareism. So this one has a dog basin at the bottom for dogs, and we know it's for dogs because it's a tiny one as opposed to a slightly bigger one for a cart horse or something, or cattle. The W.J. Barry fountain, which was at Shaftesbury Square until the 1930s, also had two sorts of animal troughs, one for beasts of burden and one for dogs. I just like it, they just did it for dogs. This is a very densely populated part of Limerick, characterised by low valuation housing, overcrowding. They have a notice on this which is kind of typical for what we know now. It says, please don't damage the fountain. It says protect the fountain from injury, and some of the fountains have this on them already. I'd like to just show this other, which is one of my favourite ones, which is sort of the metropolis comes to Limerick, which is a phrase you won't hear hugely of. So this is a lamp drinking fountain in Holborn, and this is a public drinking fountain in Pennywell in Limerick, and they're the same fountain. And we'll see this echoing further. There is nothing kind of unique under the sun, really. So when you wanted your fountain, what you did was you went to the fountain catalogue, and you metal casters, steelworks, and you said, I would like fountain 74, please. And they said, well, that's lovely, that's in Holborn. And they said, we're having this for Pennywell and Limerick. And they said, that would be so much. And you got it disassembled, and you assembled it on site or got somebody to assemble it. So the exact location of that one in Pennywell isn't really certain, but it's behind Clare Street in a very densely populated area of the town again, and we just know where we're citing it because of the Good Shepherd Convent. So this is just to show you this overlap, an Venn diagram overlap of causes. So this is obviously an animal trough, a horse trough in Tooley Street, and then this is our own homegrown one, the Calder Fountain, which has been moved twice. The profile then of these people is often this smorgasbord of causes. So Francis Calder begins the Society of Prevention for Cruelty to Animals in Belfast in 1836. And then in the 1840s, it started using its money to erect troughs for horses and cattle in the town, for the welfare of animals. And then they erect typically a fountain in Calder's memory in the quays. Now it gets damaged, which is why it was moved, and it was moved again in the reconstruction of that whole, Custom House Square area. It's lovely, actually. That Calder Fountain is a real thing to go and have a good look at because it's a real echo of back to that period. And I should just point out that Belfast had a Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals at least 50 years before, thought of having a society for the prevention of cruelty to children, but it all morphed into one another eventually. Many of the members of the Belfast Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals became convinced then that as animals needed access to water in that way for their well-being, so did people, and that if you encourage people to drink in that way, they wouldn't be going to look for other efforts. So one of my favourite people from this period, although for a different project, is Robert Bogue, who was a mayor of Belfast, and he's the one who leads that kind of movement to have more public drinking fountains. I just wanted to show you these ones, which are the kind of things that disappear more easily. So Maura and I were talking a little bit about this earlier. Things that are in the landscape and then just disappear. You'll see them everywhere. And actually now, since I started looking at fountains and that about 3 or 4 years ago, I make willing participants in our car stop and take photographs of them, which is just what happens to you when you are related to the story. So this one is fairly typical, this canister one with a little shell kind of calculating. That one in the wall is very like the ones in Limerick. Obviously, the provision of water is not just to do with temperance, it's because particularly in a city like Belfast, which is a rapidly industrialising centre, huge amount of disease, waterborne disease, access to clean water for health and well-being, so there's that idea as well. We're not talking in this paper about domestic courtyards, so I don't know if anyone saw that Dan Cruikshank programme recently about houses, development of housing in Britain. It's really good fun because he goes into real people's houses, it was great. He was going, hello, I'd like to see your house. And they said to come in. He has lovely footage of courtyards. It's well worth watching for that, and how many people were accessing very small amounts of water. So while you're thinking now, well, where do you get access to water? We were just talking about it there, you need a glass of water. You know, now you're not heading off to find your fountain and a vessel to carry it in and to bring it back to your house. A lot of these fountains have little cups and holders and things attached to them. So disease is a really important factor for their proliferation as well. In Belfast, the Drinking Fountain Association is most energetic between 1859 and the 1860s. With their last ornamental fountain being one that's pretty familiar to us all, which is in Victoria Square, which is the Jaffa Fountain. That's the last of their fountains. The period that they're most active is the period in which the city's own water, or the town's own water commissioners are relatively inactive. And that's often what happens. Philanthropic individuals step into the public sphere at times when the city or the town or the state is not stepping up to meet the need of a health or a social issue. And that in that vacuum, philanthropic individuals and like-minded people get together and step into the void, and that's what happens here. In the period that the Belfast Drinking Fountain Association is in existence, they erect 17 of these pillar ones around the place in less public, ostentatious kind of areas. So, for instance, historians of Belfast and people who are familiar with the way Belfast works, there's one in Hercules Street, there's one at Ormer Road Junction with Donegal Pass, there's one near the Poorhouse. You know, in places where they know there's going to be a lot of traffic, foot traffic. So there's Robert Bogue, he of the Fabulous Whiskers. This is not just a Belfast initiative, the Drinking Fountains Association. It's part of a Drinking Fountains movement, which spreads, really it's probably kind of a London and that end of things. They're all kind of related to one another as well, or they correspond with one another. For instance, some of the people involved in the fountain movement in Belfast had been in correspondence with Melly. And he had written to them and said, you should work for all and against no one. And the idea is you have this cause, push for that cause and allow none of the other divisive things that might distract you. You're providing fountains for animals and people, provide fountains for animals and people. You know, and you can see here that they did quite a lot of advertising, so you see the man drinking from the wall fountain and for the animals in the middle there. The other problem with some of the history of this is that when key individuals die, movements die out and key individuals die, then the history kind of dissipates and you're kind of doing on an active recovery really for them. So the first three proponents of the big fountains in Belfast are John Hind, Jake Grubb Richardson, George or Wilson. Orr and Wilson provide £100. So it's not you want to have money. This is not a light philanthropic occasion. It's a big philanthropic moment. And they had 2 fountains named after them in Arthur Square in 1860 on Queen's Island, where the People's Pleasure Park was. And that was 1860. And then John Oden, who died in Blarney in Cork at a spa, he had his at Castle Junction. I love this. He went to have water treatment for his illness, and he died in Cork. And anyway, his fountain was at Castle Junction, and it was there in 1860. Another ornamental fountain, I think, was in Fisherwick Place. And the profile of those people is what you'd imagine. They're Quakers. One of them was declared agnostic, and one of them was an Episcopalian. And they just united with one another to do this. So, just going to have a look at this one. This is, this is the penultimate one that they erected. It stood at Shaftesbury Square from 1867 until 1932. And it just shows you the passage of time. Context is everything. What seems to be fabulously the thing to have at the time, in another couple of decades suddenly becomes so old-fashioned. So the Irish builder in 1860, this is one by the architect W.J. Barry. The Irish builder thought that it was a very pretty little drinking fountain, but by 1832, when it was being removed, the Belfast Newsletter described it as squat, stumpy, obsolete, and not a memorial to anyone or anything. And they churned it up and used it to grit the road. So these are, obviously, this is my favourite fountain, in the favourite fountain in the list, which is the memorial to Daniel Joseph Jaffa, erected by the Drinking Fountain Association, and but subscribed to by Otto Jaffa, who was Ireland's first Jewish Lord Mayor and Ireland's first Jewish High Sheriff. Anyway, so this is to his father, and for some of us, we will remember it lingering long and last and rusty in the corner of Ridgeway Street in Botanic Gardens, where it was hoofed off to in the 1930s because cars, the Belfast City Council decided that it was a hazard to cars. So they wrote to his son, not a great time to be writing to the son of a Jewish person, and saying, I'm sorry, your memorial to your father seems to be in the way. We're moving it to the corner of Ridgeway Street, where somebody will pass it 80 years later and say, what is that? And it's one of my favourite moments of Belfast City Council history is this fountain, because when they redeveloped Victoria Square, somebody in the council said, isn't there be a lovely fountain in the lovely fountain? And they went, oh, that's 2 pieces in Ridgeway Street, or off Ridgeway Street. And they got the developer to send it to a Victorian specialist and entirely redo it, which cost the developer $25,000, which is peanuts really to a developer. I quite like that partnership between council and private initiative and public heritage, and that they did that because they just did a great job. And now young people can sit underneath it and smoke on a Saturday night when they're waiting for their mums and dads to pick them up, which is great. But in any case, it's still brilliant. It's still worth there should be like one of those, information things next to it that says what it is, but there isn't. So, alarmingly for Belfast, and this is where our route will be to Limerick to destroy this one. This is the exact same fountain, but painted in, you could have it in 2 colours. And this is in the People's Park in Limerick. We haven't really included any of the public park photos of fountains because they're slightly different beastie, because they're not, also because parks weren't entirely public for all of their lives often, and there's slightly restricted access sometimes. This one, Jaffa wanted this one near his factory so his workers could avail of it, and then they didn't site it there, they sited it near the morgue. So, right, so this is the Berwick Fountain in Cork, and this is also put up as a gift. It was the gift of Walter Berwick, who was a district magistrate, and it was a gift to the city's citizens. Unfortunately, and this is not typical of Cork, the council then did not supply it with water for a further 2 years until the complaints about children playing in the dry basin finally encouraged them to get it functioning. So they then finally did get it functioning, and actually it was very unloved for a lot of even its modern life. I remember it in the 1980s being fairly unloved. It's very lovely now, as you can see, because they've redeveloped the streetscape. There were 4 other fountains in Cork. That's my small child photobombing, my very professional photograph of what I think is the base of one of the fountains, which they was on the 4 corners of this very busy junction. There were 4 fountains, and the fountains were the type which are lamps and fountains. So if I have a lamp, when you can have a lamp fountain. So it was a lamp, obviously it's like the street, but a fountain on the bottom. And then that both protected the lamp, but provided light to the area, and it was dual function. So, like, just fabulous. There were 4 there. And whether Maura and I can't decide whether that is the base of an old one, but we can think it's the only reason that they didn't remove it when they redeveloped the streetscape, because it's an ugly piece of metal as it stands. These are the public drinking fountains that they originally preferred in Cork, which is this kind of one here, with the lion's head spouting the water, and then a little cup to have it. But all over Cork, and I'd say Limerick, but in Belfast certainly, these wall ones were fairly ubiquitous. He's the man at the moment really, but I know you've come to Father Matthew. So, and I thought it was quite funny really to have a photograph of Father Matthew in a flood. So as you can see in this other photograph, he's entirely consumed with water because Cork's drainage was so poor at the time. Anyway, so I'm obviously from Cork, and the Father Matthew statue is a landmark in the streetscape of the town, of the city. And you get off the bus at the statue, you meet people at the statue, dates were arranged around the statue. The bus office, which you can see their little hut there, they had a hut at the office. But it's only last year when I made my mother stop as we crossed the street dangerously and illegally, and pointed out to her that it was a fountain, that she finally realised, and she's 88, that it was a fountain. So this drinking fountain was, I love the stuff with that Laura was mentioning about Father Matthew, because a lot of those temperance groups in Belfast were named after Father Matthew. The Cork temperance this, the Father Matthew temperance that. Father Matthew is a kind of, he's a biography of some of the temperance movement people. Like a lot of the people involved in other fountains in other parts of Ireland, this is an ecumenical, cross-religious effort to gather the money to fund the erection of this statue in his memory. So it's multi-denominational. The people involved in contributing to the erection of the statue are involved in temperance. The only the temperance branch of the ITL outside of the north is in Cork. A lot of Quakers are involved in gathering money for this statue. There's a big parade. For it. I'm not sure how long it functioned as a fountain because nobody would be using it now. This is the other fountain in Cork, which was the gift of the Dunscombe family. And the Dunscombes gave this fountain to the Cork Corporation in the 1880s, and it's at the bottom of a very working class area, a hill coming out of a very working class area. And one of the problems with the Dunscombe fountain, and this is where I'm kind of concluding with what we're talking about, is that the fountains are not just temperance gestures, which they are, or philanthropic gestures of those concerned with public health, which they are, or the gestures of rich philanthropic men to have somebody call a fountain after them, which they also are. But they're also social sites of interaction and engagement and the life of towns and cities. Where people gather. These are the street water coolers of modern offices, or the kitchen of a shared workplace, or actually your own kitchen when you wander in and say, are you putting the kettle on? So the Dunscombe fountain I love because it's of an ornamental type with the lamp on the top. You can see the lamp on the top there. But actually, by the 1930s, it's no longer functioning as a fountain, but Shawleys gathered there to exchange clothes, to sell clothes and scraps and bits of cloth and everything. So there were lots of complaints about the Dunscombe fountain going back to the 1850s, because in the 1850s the Reverend Dr. Nelligan complained about the noise, confusion, blaspheming and scolding of women assembled there. So imagine they were just doing the same as they're doing in this picture. In Belfast, ornamental fountains, or those public fountains, are not sited near churches or schools, but they are the sites of other sorts of reprehensible behaviour. So in 1864, a man in Belfast was brought before the magistrates for being drunk and disorderly and assaulting his wife, who was also reported to be drunk. But actually, he was holding her head under the fountain, so that's how he was arrested. That's how they came across the fact that he was drunk. So I just want to kind of conclude with this, which is one of the things that Leanne and Maura and myself are all interested in, which is social behaviour in public spaces, and that's obviously another temperance line really. So these fountains are magnets for children, and either sent to get water for others, or to drink themselves, or to hang out with their friends. And it's that combination obviously of children and mischief, the opportunity for mischief, and water, which any of us know that unseasonal weather Belfast had a few weeks ago. Children and water, that's what they want. So in the 1860s, a female street preacher used Odin's fountain, which, as I mentioned, is at Junction of Castle Junction, in front of Primark, basically. So she stood up there and decided to preach the gospel. Children began to heckle her because there's lots of children gathered around there, and then they climbed the fountain and started to splash her with water. So she legged it up High Street, and there's a police office at the top of High Street, so she legged it up High Street, pursued by hysterical children enjoying themselves as they were. And when she got to the police office, they were kind of surprised because they described her as a respectable woman, which basically means that she was dressed nicely and they could class her, and they suggested that she put herself together and not do that again. 7 years later, another female preacher chose the Shaftesbury Square fountain, which, I point out W.J. Barry's fountain, as her stage for preaching, and see how she's treated slightly differently. So Eliza Irvine was brought before the court for obstruction. The judge was unsympathetic to her calling, and on hearing that she was married with a child and had part of a house, expressed the opinion that she would be better employed minding her child and paying attention to her domestic duties. She's lower class really, or she's lower class than the other woman, and he fined her 20 shillings in costs. In Cork, in the 1840s, the Christian brothers on Sullivan's Quay complained that the children were stopping him by using the fountain. He was stopping children from going to use the public fountain that I've mentioned. So here we have the idealised family using the fountain, a very sober man, lovely cop to lovely adoring children, all beautifully dressed, shod, lovely mother, all clean and fabulous. And somebody's carrying, a newspaper, it seems so wonderful. Actually, more likely is the centre picture where these, barefoot little urchins are hanging around. These are newspaper boys on the far right. Anyway, so in the 1840s, the Christian brothers said they were stopping the children from using the fountains because their minds were becoming poisoned by the types of discussions held there. As a result, a policeman was sent to keep the fountain silent. And keeping the silent, that's basically for women. So women are the most frequent users of those fountains in areas where there's an intensity of housing or population in housing. And so a policeman was stood by that fountain for a long period of time to keep them quiet. So I'm just going to finish up there. Our interest in the fountains really is to use them as a biography of philanthropic behaviour in the period, and highlighting some of the temperance associations.
First of all, thank you to Orla, to Janice for inviting me this afternoon to a wonderful, wonderful conference. It's really, really nice to be asked and great to be back in Belfast. I suppose the first thing to say is that I am not an historian of temperance as such, so that's an important thing to say. I'm at the moment, in the last couple of years, an historian of institutions dealing with drunkenness. Believe it or not, especially in the south of Ireland, the temperance movement didn't really come into it. Now you'll see that in a little while. The inebriate reformatories came together really because of I suppose, and maybe Orla could speak to this as well, that there was a branch, I suppose, of this broad movement throughout the 19th century. There was one half that advocated for an institutional option, and there was another half, I think, from what I can see, that advocated for a non-institutional option. I look at my title there and I think that I'm talking about Belfast and the Inebriate Act 1900 to 1920, and many of you might be afraid that I'm going to go into a legislative lesson here, which at this time on a Thursday evening wouldn't be too good. So essentially I'm going to talk about a little retreat, as it was known here in Belfast. But before I do, I'll set the context. Between 1899 and 1908, 4 inebriate homes or reformatories were established on the island of Ireland with the assorted purpose of treating, reforming or punishing habitual and criminal adult drunkards. Now, these institutions were the culmination of a century of reform attempts, legislation, temperance advocacy and so forth, which still saw the drunkard retain the distinction as being one of the key disruptive forces in the Irish prison system. As Janice mentioned, I've written on Borstall's, my wider research and specialism would be within the prison system itself, which is where I met the drunkards, and there were plenty of them right there. None of these 4 institutions that I mentioned lasted beyond the end of the First World War. A number of other key legislative interventions. The key legislative interventions affected the status of the habitual drunkard in as the 19th century drew to a close, but it was the Inebriates Act in 1898 which brought about the establishment of the inebriate reformatory system. This act allowed for the division of criminal inebriates into a number of categories. The first was the individual found guilty of an offence committed under, and this is all just technical, so don't try and remember it. The first was the individual found guilty of an offence committed under the influence of alcohol. Such a person would first have to be declared to be an habitual drunkard by the court. So a magistrate would have to be persuaded by usually a police sergeant or a family member that this person had a history of drunkenness. And if this was so proved, then the convict could be sentenced to a term of up to 3 years in an inebriate reformatory. So to qualify for treatment under the Act, or punishment/treatment under the 1898 Act, you had to be deemed to be an habitual drunkard. You will hear me use the term drunkard a lot this afternoon. It's not me being derogatory, I'm using the language of the time, so just to be clear on that. The second category then was any adult drunkard who had been convicted of one of a number of drunken acts of at least 3 times within the previous year. Again, he or she had first to be declared an habitual drunkard, and the sentence was the same. So, before I go any further then, I would like to offer a number of definitions for the type of drinker that floated around legislative and reformative circles during the lifetime of the reformatory. Now, this comes from the report of the inspector under the Inebriates Act, Acts 1979 to 1900, and the report itself is from 1912. So you see them there, they were defined as moderate drinkers, persons who are always strictly moderate. See if you can find yourself in here, by the way. Persons who are always strictly moderate in their indulgence. Occasional drunkards, persons who drink more freely than is consistent with moderation and are occasionally drunken. Inebriates, persons who are habitually under the influence of drink or with intervals of abstinence are subject to outbursts of uncontrollable drunkenness of more or less duration. So this is how they summed them up. This is how officialdom summed up the drunkards at the time. So were definitions, I suppose, that sort of began in those circles from about 1879, and as the legislation updated, we would kind of come to something like this. The legislation, the 1898 legislation, provided for the establishment of 3 types of institutional treatment for the habitual criminal drunkard. Inebriate retreats would be set up and operated by individuals or charities and run as private hospitals for patients who could afford to pay. That's what I'm going to be talking to you about in a moment or two. But just to draw attention to the others. So we have, as you're looking at it in the bottom right, that's the right-hand corner, the inebriate retreat. I've been incorrect starting date there, 1904, but we'll talk about that in a minute. These are the 3 types of institutions provided for under the 1898 Act. The retreat, the least severe of all of them. The certified inebriate reformatory. This was one from where you could be admitted by a court, okay? For usually your crime was just drunkenness, public drunkenness. It wasn't of the more severe type of alcohol-related crime. The certified inebriate reformatories were operated by generally local authorities in partnership with the state. So if a local authority in a given county, say for instance Mayo or Cork, if their local authorities at local government level bought into the system, then the judges, if you can follow this train, the judges in that county were allowed to send people to the inebriate reformatories. So in other words, the local authority in Mayo could say, okay, we're going to pay so much a week or a month to keep our drunkards in the certified reformatory if the courts deem them fit for that system. Otherwise, the courts in that counties who didn't buy into the system would and could just send them to the normal prison system or do whatever else they wanted with them. At the top of the screen is I should say then there were 2 certified reformatories in Ireland. Wexford for females and St. Bridget's in Wexford and St. Patrick's in Waterford, 1906 and 1908 respectively. I'm not going to get into those today because we're here in Belfast and we want to talk about the Belfast related one. The State Inebriate Reformatory in Ennis is the big one here. This was operated by the prison system. It opened in 1900, it was relatively short-lived, it closed in 1918. It housed 330 inmates in its time, which made it small enough as well. I'll just talk a little bit about these. These are the available stats I have for Ennis. I don't have such stats for the others, unfortunately. I don't have any for the others. But for Ennis, you could only be sent here by a court. Your period, eventually it was up to 3 years. As I say, 330 over time, over the 18-year period. 204 were women, 126 were men. That tells a story straight away. It's, I suppose, again, it's outside the scope of what I'm planning to discuss today, but I'm happy to discuss it in questions afterwards. You'll be happy to know that the city in which we are here this afternoon sent the majority of drunkards to Ennis, 100. It's funny because, as Janice said, my first book was on the Borstal system, and that was based in Clonmel. And guess who also sent the most amount of inmates to the Borstal system for juvenile adult offending boys? Belfast sent a majority of inmates there as well. So I won't tease that out, I'll let you tease that out yourselves. Dublin sent the next highest number of 84, Galway, Cork and the rest of Ireland. Of course, it's no surprise, I suppose, to see that the cities sent the greater numbers of people. This is because, I suppose, and it might be simplistic to say this, the greater opportunities for this kind of offending existed in the cities. Child-related offences were the highest, the most numerically popular common crime, if you want, in Ennis. Child neglect, I divide them up into child neglect because that's how they appear. Ill-treating children and cruelty to children. In the book I have plenty of case studies of that actually. It's very horrific, the cases were very bad. I will say all of the crimes all of the child-related offences bar one were charged to women, as far as I know, where women were convicted. And, that immediately, I suppose, might lead one to draw some conclusion about these terrible drunken women and how cruel they were and awful they were to their children. But then I was very fortunate with Ennis to have some very good case study, source material that allowed me to really build up some good case studies. And you look deeper into the lives of the women, and again we're talking the first 2 decades of the 20th century, and you look into their lives, and even you can get a backstory in their lives, because the case studies allowed that, because the records were so good. And then you realise all was not what it seemed. It wasn't as simple as take her up, put her in the dock, disgrace her, humiliate her, and how awful she was. It's only 2 or 3 years into her story you realise, what they didn't hear in court was actually she had several black eyes from time to time. She had several bruises, and all wasn't well in the house. So, the benefit of the doubt was certainly not given to women, but I better not go down that road, because I could talk about that all day. Yeah, we've seen the sending locations. I'll talk about the lodge in a moment. I'll go back there because I won't spoil it. So, there are the 3 institutions, at any rate, that come under the 1898 Act. Ireland's only inebriate retreat, and I'll tease this out now, was opened in Belfast in 1902 by the Irish Women's Temperance League for the treatment of Protestant women only. Protestant women who were not sent there by the courts. It was purely an institution of voluntary admission. Voluntary might be, a bit generous, probably coerced, led in by the neck by somebody or other, but there was no court involved. That's the main thing, and the women there were not criminals. Certified retreats could be established privately, but they were licensed, inspected and part funded in the case of Ireland by the British government set up in Dublin Castle. As I said, there were 2 certified reformatories, St Patrick's in Watford, St Bridget's in Wexford. Inebriate retreats could be established and operated by private individuals or charities. They effectively worked as private hospitals and were only available to those who could afford them. Admission, as I said, was purely voluntary. The institution was something of a throwback to earlier reform attempts and essentially catered for the better class of drunkard. We do have and again, if you read all the case studies I was able to do, and even the ones that lots of other people have done, we have this stereotypical image of the drunkard, especially the criminal drunkard, and the shabby-looking creature and so forth. This was not for that person. This retreat was for a different kind of person. The Act gave power to any county or borough council to contribute money towards the maintenance of an inebriate retreat, and again, the local authorities were permitted to join forces on the projects if they wanted. Now, so admission, as I said, was voluntary, and the court had no authority to sentence any patient to be there. The patients, as they were designated in the retreat, there were inmates in the reformatory, there were inmates in the certified reformatory, there were patients in the retreat. The patients, as they were designated, were not committed to a retreat for any criminal activity. So no criminal offence was committed that brought them there. It's not to say they hadn't committed other criminal offences in their lives. Once a patient was admitted, however, the courts automatically had a function in their detention. This is interesting. While a distressed inebriate might have been coerced or forcefully persuaded to enter a retreat in their own best interest by a family member, friends, an intervention, as we call it, I suppose, in the modern world, It may not necessarily have been spelled out to them, although they were coerced to go in, it may not have been spelled out to them that once the admission was formalised, they were effectively at the mercy of the institution's managers and a judge. Firstly, the individual could not be discharged from the retreat during the first 12 months unless they made an application to the courts and proved special circumstances such as a family crisis that necessitated a permanent return to the home. Secondly, any patient of the retreat may have had their term extended or be readmitted as an habitual drunkard on the direction of a judge. So effectively this meant that the word of the retreat managers would be most influential in persuading the courts of the fate of a patient, that a patient may or may not have sufficiently progressed in their treatment. If a patient escaped from the retreat, then the time from the beginning to the end of that absence was not treated as a part of their period of detention and would be added on afterwards. The legislation gave a number of additional powers to the Home Secretary concerning the operation of the licensed retreat. He had the power to alter or refine the procedures for admission or readmission as the government saw fit. A very important function that the government had in all of this, in the bottom two actually of these institutions, including the retreats, was the power of inspection. Once the retreats became licensed under the 1898 Act, this allowed for the inspector of inebriate reformatories and retreats, who in Dublin during this time I think was George Plunkett O'Farrell. He was allowed to go in more than once a year, I presume. It wasn't actually specified. He was an inspector, I suppose, so he could go in whenever he wanted, but he certainly reported annually and do what it says in the tin: inspect and report and provide some analysis on what was going on and how it was working. The reports, I'll talk about more detail later, are important sources, but for the fact that these institutions start to coincide with World War I, and a lot of these reports suddenly become very thin, so we don't get a lot of detail, and that's frustrating. In theory, no woman who entered the inebriate retreat in Belfast became a patient against her will, in theory. However, George Bretherton argues in an article that some less than legal coercion was usually necessary in order to persuade individuals to commit themselves. This may have involved a combination of persuasion from family, temperance workers, retreat managers, perhaps even the police. This stuff isn't the stuff that was written down necessarily, so we can't trace it back, but you can imagine maybe a police officer, sergeant or whatever, maybe brought into a house at the request of some other family members and said, here, put a bit of pressure on here, we have somewhere for this person, threaten that you're going to lock them up the next time or something. This happens. So to talk about the lodge, as it was known. Although officially opened under licence in 1903, the lodge, as it was known, commenced operations independently in 1902. Now again, many of you are from Belfast or work in Belfast are going to be far more familiar with the locations than me, so forgive me on that. It was founded by the Irish Women's Temperance Union. The name of its founding organisations and so forth changes, and its management or organisation changes slightly from union to league or whatever in the reports. I reproduce it as I've seen it in the reports, so I stay loyal to the sources I used. During the initial period, it was funded by subscriptions from around the country. Described as, and I quote, an ordinary villa situated in a good residential district in the eastern suburbs of Belfast, the lodge contained a dining room, drawing room, small library, a workroom, 8 bedrooms, a conservatory, a kitchen, a pantry, bathrooms, as well as other sanitary accommodation, all standing on a 1.5 acre site. So it sounds positively attractive and something that any of us would like a weekend in. Once the facility opened in 1902, there was little need for physical alteration, but the managers quickly realised a fundamental flaw in their plans. Now, bear in mind, it was licensed in 1903, but it opened independently of the 1898 Act. It opened in 1902. So in other words, it was kind of running without any legislative backup for the first year. The managers realised that this was a flaw. Without the ability to confine patients against their will, the managers could not guarantee a consistent and enduring solution. Patients had the right to walk away from their treatment at any time. It was this factor that motivated the founders to seek to bring the lodge under the rules of the 1898 Act and have it legally designated as a licensed inebriate retreat. It would be fair to assume that the retreat stood little chance of survival as a standalone institution of reform, but under the umbrella of the legislation and compellability, there was the possibility that it would endure. And this was very important, and this is why the little retreat in Belfast, as it was known, and as I kind of subtitled my chapter in the book that deals with the lodge, this is why it lasted longer than all of the other of all the 4 institutions I outlined, the 2 in Wexford and Waterford and Ennis. A 24-month licence to operate the lodge as an inebriate retreat was granted by the Council of the County Borough of Belfast on the 8th of May 1903. The licence granted permission to receive up to 15 patients and was made in the name of the matron Kate McPherson. Upon the granting of the licence, any patients already in residence were either discharged or with their own consent signed the mandatory application for admission and became patients under the Inebriate Act. Those inmates who opted to remain did so in the knowledge that under the Inebriates Act 1898, the managers now had the power to detain them until reform is deemed to have been achieved and against their will if necessary. The power of compulsory detention, as I said, was deemed crucial to the success of any institution, and a prolonged absence from alcohol was seen as one of the keys to lasting reform. I mean, you know, this was the problem with Ennis in the early years, the state reformatory, where people were sent for criminal drunken acts from the courts. I have one tremendous lady at the age of 73, 145 previous convictions for drunkenness, was put away, and she had been drinking heavily for about the previous 20 years. She was from Croom in Limerick, and she had spent 20 years hard drinking and was detained for 6 months in Ennis Inebriate Reformatory. So after 20 years drinking, she's 73, they think they're going to reform her in 6 months. I found her still going strong at the age of 82 in the prison records, still getting locked up for drunken disorderly behaviour. So this thing of compellability, the ability to keep people in there for as long a time as possible, was seen as key to it all. While opening the lodge, of course, was of course a significant achievement, it must be remembered that this was just one small institution serving Protestant women who could afford to stay there. In reality, this represented only a tiny minority of the overall population of the country, and even then, only a minority of the most problematic sector of society in relation to drunkenness. So it was a drop in the ocean, pardon the pun. We've had a lot about water this afternoon. With those wells, those fountains, one would not want to have a suggestive bladder for that. That I was thinking. It's certainly a fascinating paper, though. The licence for the retreat in Belfast was renewed on the 3rd of April 1905. At the beginning of that year, there were 11 patients residing in the lodge, so you see the small scale of this. And by December, there were 12. Following the expected round of admission and discharges, this increased to 13. Now, of those, one of those 13 was readmitted following the expiration of her initial period of detention. She elected voluntarily to remain and presumably to continue the reform process. As the modest, albeit solid progress of the retreat in Belfast began to take hold, its supporters and temperance advocates used the lodge to strengthen their arguments for more aggressive action. At a scholarly social gathering held in the city, the retired RIC Inspector General Sir Andrew Reidy pointed out that while Irish people spent over £13 million on alcohol during 1905, seems an extraordinary figure to me, but that's what I found from a contemporary source. The government received £6 million in customs duty. Out of that latter figure, 110,788 was allocated from the duty on beer and spirits for the relief of local taxation. Now, Reidy complained that in light of the fact that the lodge received no government support, should some of this money not now be redirected towards it and towards the state institution at Ennis. He called on the temperance movement in Belfast to take campaigning action in this regard, including sending lobbyists to Westminster to make the case. As well as this, he advocated for the opening of 2 further inebriate homes outside the city of Belfast, I quote, where the inmates could be employed and get fresh air, unquote. Of course, the key treatment in all of these institutions was fresh air, nourishment, good moral guidance, and access to education. While the conditions and facilities within the lodge may have seemed somewhat lavish, with its drawing rooms and its library and its conservatory, they paled into insignificance when compared with the model of the inebriate retreats in England. One such one was the Duxhurst Farm, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, but I might not be, Duxhurst Farm Colony for inebriate females, which was a purpose-built village built on the slopes of the hills of Surrey. Breezy, and I'm quoting here from a contemporary article from the Journal of the Study for Inebriating. A breezy upland farm overlooking the beautiful plains that stretch away for miles on either side. Lady Henry Somerset's description of the 180-acre estate she founded with the British Women's Temperance Association in 1896 could not be much farther removed from the modest villa in suburban Belfast. While the opening of Duxhurst predated the 1898 Act by 2 years, it was eventually brought under its remit as an inebriate retreat. A direct comparison between the lodge in Belfast and Duxhurst in Surrey is perhaps a bit unfair, because even when measured alongside other British retreats, the latter was indeed lavish in scale, scope and decor. The buildings of the colony included a collection of small cottages, each one inhabited by 7 to 10 women, along with a nurse sister to superintend each family, as they were called. The cottages were arranged around a green area, and nearby a hospital and a church. In an adjoining meadow, there was a building named the Children's Nest, which housed some of the children of the women living in the cottages. So this sounds very Disney-esque, to be honest with you. It's again lavish even in comparison to what else was in Britain at the time. Their presence was seen as helpful, according to Somerset. Children brought joy and health to all men, despite the fact it was a colony for women, but we'll overlook that. Along with this, they served as a constant reminder to the women of what sin means to the innocent. As well as all of this, the colony was abundant with lawns, vegetable and flower gardens, a farm stocked with animals cared for by the women, and facilities for indoor industry such as embroidery and weaving. In Britain, and to an extent in Ireland, Duxhurst became the standard bearer and in some ways the selling point for inebriate legislation and reformatories. On many occasions it was cited in public commentary when a campaigner or politician was attempting to win support for any given initiative that they were trying out. It became the project to which all others should aspire, in other words, but in reality its facilities were out of reach for most temperance organisations on both sides of the Irish Sea. And I can tell you, as someone who has looked at in great detail at at penal reform in Ireland in the early 20th century, and they were barking up the wrong tree if they thought anything akin to this was going to happen anywhere on the island of Ireland. I spoke earlier about these images of, or I suppose our impressions of different inebriates. This is the Drunkard's Bible. Now, look, I just picked these at random from the Welcome Images Library, just, I suppose, to highlight the fact that historically inebriates were not typically visually represented as anything other than poor, bedraggled, dishevelled and impoverished. We do not see them represented in the forms of which there were almost certainly a small but sizable number. That is, well-to-do, middle-class, educated or well-married. These were the types of women that likely inhabited the lodge in Belfast. But we don't see them, is what I'm trying to say in an awkward way, we don't see them in these kind of contemporary images depicted in that way. In Ennis, they generally were downtrodden, dishevelled, bedraggled and poor. There were one or two who came from the upper classes of society in terms of wealth. The women in the lodge certainly fitted some of these better descriptions, as I say. When compared with almost any institution of reform in early 20th century Ireland, the lodge was modest in scale and population. Legally permitted, as I said, to hold 15 patients, and during its early years it almost always reached that capacity, apart from 1903. In 1904, the lodge the retreat hit one of its very few high points when it admitted 19 women during that calendar year. Given that it was licensed to hold just 15, it could possibly be assumed that not all 19 were in residence at the same time, but that's not guaranteed either. It potentially did go over the licence. This initial spike, I would say, can probably be accounted for by the fact that the institution was new and gave rise to some degree of curiosity among certain classes, particularly that sector at which its services were aimed. In the 3 years between 1905 and 1907 inclusive, the numbers remained steady at 15, 12 and 13 respectively. But then between 1908 and 1910, there were just 8, 9 and 8 admissions each year. So again, very modest, very small numbers, considering the potential that an institution like this should have offered. It's interesting that there wasn't a greater uptake. In 1907 there were some changes that allowed for an alteration to the numbers potentially staying at the lodge. Firstly though it retained the same name, the institution moved to a new facility in a different suburb of Belfast. The newer and larger building was located at Irwin Avenue in the Strandtown area of the city. The retreat was now larger with, and I quote, airy rooms and a larger site of 3 acres on which to facilitate a wider range of outdoor activity for the women. Remember, the first one was only on 1.5 acres, and the fresh air was important here. Secondly, when the licence for the retreat was renewed in mid-1907, the number of patients permitted was now increased to 16. This was a small but significant expansion, and crucially the new building was capable of receiving a much larger number than the 16 for which it was licensed. So it probably did exceed its licensed number. Whether the managers had any discretion to do this, we're not sure. It's not said. Now, as the First World War took hold, official reports, and I'm watching the clock here now in front of me, so I'm conscious of that in case you're getting worried there. Official reports took on all the inebriate institutions became shorter as government assets were clearly directed elsewhere, and the government didn't really have time to, I suppose, send inspectors and to small, tiny, modest retreats such as Belfast, The ones in Wexford and Waterford were nearly gone by this stage. They lasted very, very little time. So we learn far less about them as the years go on, about the lodge. The lodge, though, did admit 18, 19 and 15 patients in 1915, 16, 17 respectively. So we're back into the mid-teens again. During 1918, the final year for which an official report on the retreat seems to be available, the inspector reported that 15 women were admitted as patients. Now, since its licensing under the Inebriates Act in 1903, so between 1903 and 1918, 224 patients had passed through the lodge. So in its totality, that's a better number. It seems to be a better number, considering the small numbers that were held at a time. So to just move on very quickly, those applying for a licence then to operate were obliged to fulfil certain requirements. And they did so, the applications were submitted to the Lord Lieutenant for Ireland in Dublin Castle. And you needed to provide very, very fine and specific detail about the layout of the building, the type of facilities, fire escapes, drainage provisions, sanitation, sleeping areas, offices, all of this needed to be provided. Once these basic minimum requirements were established and set in place, it was the responsibility of the managers to maintain the building with little or no interference from the government representatives. At times, the inspector of inebriate reformatories would draw attention to certain matters. Such an example took place during the first year of the lodge's licence, when the inspector pointed out that barbed wire on the perimeter walls of the complex projected an undesirable prison-like impression. It was almost certainly the case that the inspector was aware that such an impression would not encourage patients to admit themselves to an institution that was, after all, voluntary in admission. So the management in the early years in particular were heavily dependent on contributions from their supporters around the country. And some of them, and I'll just name one or two here, the Messrs. Brown of Donoughmore led the field of contributions for the first year by giving £150, a gift that allowed the organisation to fully furnish the retreat without touching their own capital budget for the project. Other examples included generous donations. Very generous donations include £5 each from Mrs. Eason of Dublin, and with the additional £5 as the year's result of the Rathgar coffee barrow, it's Rathgar in Dublin, one would presume, allowed for the purchase of a piano for the retreat. So music was heard within the walls of this place. So there were lots of other. There are lists. I don't have any with me, but there are lists of the donors and subscribers and so forth that are published in the report of the Inspector of Inebriate Reformatories. The retreat differed from the state-run institutions in another significant way. Inmates of the certified and state reformatories were subject to certain restrictions when it came to writing and receiving letters, as well as visits. In the retreat, there were generally no restrictions in this regard. Patients were allowed to receive visitors at all reasonable times, as long as managers deemed those visits suitable. In other words, if a particular individual visit was deemed to be detrimental to the recovery of a woman, then the licensee had a legal obligation to withdraw consent to that visit. And then if this happened, the Inspector of Inebriate Reformatories needed to be informed. Not surprisingly, patients of the retreat were prohibited from entering a public house and or any other establishment where alcoholic drink was sold without first obtaining written permission from the retreat licensee. Now, this rule is somewhat vague. However, it does not specify whether a patient could enter an establishment where alcohol was merely available. So, could you go where it was available but not for sale? So there was that's a grey area. So, to move on then, and I'm conscious of time, the inspector and what we learn about the retreat, unfortunately, in Belfast, much of it comes from the inspector. The inspector had an access all areas pass basically to the retreat and had full control from a distance over what they did, but not on a day-to-day basis, but he could certainly change things if they wanted to. It's not been possible to ascertain exactly when the Lodge Inebriate Retreat ceased to exist. The lack of an official archive on the institution that I have been able to find, and I'm hoping to God somebody doesn't stand up and announce that there is one somewhere, because I wasn't able to find it for my book. The lack of an official archive makes certain facts difficult to obtain, and there is some confusion over the date of closure. Elizabeth Malcolm suggests, and I'm coming to an end here, suggests that it ended its work sometime during 1920. Official reporting on the retreat did not continue beyond 1917, that is from the inspector. This could possibly be accounted for by a number of causes. As I said, the Great War was still going on, government resources were burdened. The British administration in Dublin Castle was, of course, by this stage, by 1718, becoming increasingly preoccupied with by the onset of revolution in Ireland. And I saw this with my prison research as well. I mean, the reports got thinner at that time in history. And they became, as I say, preoccupied and more embroiled with what was happening on their own doorstep. While Malcolm's proposal that the retreat almost ceased operations in 1920 does appear reasonable, there is some suggestion that it may have lasted beyond this time. I was able to, quite by accident, find two separate wills that appeared, or notices of wills that appeared in the Belfast Gazette in February 1932. The first of those dealt with the disposal of the estate of Jane Amelia Carson of Myrtlefield Park, Belfast. The deceased was named as a spinster, and her will was dated the 15th of September 1924. Okay, that's important. Among the many financial legacies she bequeathed to different organisations was the sum of £30 to the Inebriate Home for Women, the Lodge, Irwin Avenue, Belfast. So she signed that will in 1924. It doesn't provide concrete evidence, I know, that the lodge was still out in operation, but it certainly seems to have been the opinion of the deceased and her legal advisor that it was still in operation. A second such notice was published in the Gazette on the same day. The will of Ellen Jane Montgomery of the 4th Avenue, Baylands, Bangor, County Down, was dated the 4th of January 1926, and she bequeathed all her property to the trustees, upon trust for the benefit of her husband for his life. Upon his death, she named a number of charitable organisations that should benefit, and among these was a donation of £50 to the Irish Women's Temperance Union Home for Inebriates, Irwin Avenue, Belfast. That is January 1926. So again, they still felt it existed at that time. Once again, this is more suggestive or circumstantial evidence rather than solid proof that the retreat was still operational when the will was signed. It's an indication that somebody somewhere in the city believed it existed. There are passing then references in unrelated catalogue entries that I found here at PRONI to suggest that the lodge closed down in 1930. And although unverified, and this does seem to me like the most logical closing date, and this seems like an appropriate closing date for me as well, so thank you very much.